fixing your car with a firing pin from a gun, running from the authorities, listening to the podcast, now becoming a guest, going from honor to dishonor, back to honor in life. All this and so much more right now.
The Remarkable People Podcast. Check it out. The Remarkable People Podcast. Listen, do, repeat for life. The Remarkable People Podcast.
Hello, friends. Welcome to this week's episode of the Remarkable People Podcast. This week, we have a longtime listener that reached out 6 months ago from when we're recording this. We just now got to record his remarkable episode, and you're probably not going to listen to it for another 4 to 6 weeks. But it's super exciting because we're going to see our guest's journey from honor to dishonor, back to honor, how he learned to get off his ass, how he took a pin from a gun, put it inside his car so he could get to his drug dealer's house while he's fleeing from the police so he could turn him in the next day. But he talks about, despite the mess of his life that he made, how God forgave, how he restored him, and how he now has a career and a wife and beautiful children, and wrote the book Dishonor to help us all be redeemed and come to know peace, joy, and love. So check out the Remarkable People Volume 1 book. Listen to this episode and check out our guest book, Dishonor. And most of all, don't just listen to this great content, but like our slogan says, do it, repeat it each day so you can have a great life in this world and an eternity to come. So I'm David Pasqualone. Whether you're a first-time listener or a serial listener and you've listened to every episode of our podcast, we thank you for being here today. We hope this episode helps you. It also helps those you love when you forward it to them. And our whole goal is to glorify God and to help you grow so the world's a better place. I'm David Pasqualone, and welcome to the David Mike Story. Hey, David, how are you today, brother?
Good. Thanks for letting me talk to your audience. I appreciate it.
Oh, it's an honor to have you. And I was just telling our listeners a little bit about you. You wrote a book called Dishonor, and we're going to go through your life story just like we do with all our guests, the good, the bad, and the ugly, the highs, the lows, the everything in between. We'll start off at your birth and move through life to today. Then we'll transition to where is David today and where are you heading? So now that you just helped us, now let's try to help you. So on that note, one thing I wanted to talk about before we get started is, if a listener right now is, should I continue with this podcast or should I shut it off? They're going to get a ton of gold from you and a ton of information they can apply to their life. But if there is one central message they're going to leave with if they listen to your podcast episode, what is that going to be?
You do not have to be defined by your past. That's going to be the biggest nugget I think they're going to take away from this episode.
Awesome. And how many of us need that exact message, right?
I think
past
everybody
haunts us. Yeah. So let's do this, David. At this time, where were you born? What was your family like? What was your upbringing like? Mom and dad in the home, brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles. Where were you?
So I was born in Connecticut. My parents, or actually my dad, was drafted in 1968 and decided that he didn't want to go into the Army. So he joined the Air Force. My parents are married, and 9 months and a day later, I was born. So, but then after that, my father moved to England. So we ended up having to move over there with him. And then he drug us around the world, for many years after that with a career in the Air Force. So I moved from England to South Carolina to Louisiana to Germany, which is where I went to high school. And then kind of the story picks up from there. I have two brothers and one sister. And so we all grew up together, pretty tight-knit family. And, some of the experiences we've had were traveling around and seeing some cool stuff. But my father was really big into going to church, and he was the music director at the church we went to in South Carolina for years. And so, we used to go to church on Sunday morning, Sunday night. There was multiple days in the week where we would go because of the things that his responsibilities. There was like a Saturday bus route that we would knock on doors and try and get kids to come to the church, and Wednesday nights. So we spent a lot of time in church growing up. So that's kind of like the backstory a little bit.
And back then, was that something that you were like, man, I'm tired of this? Or was it you understood and I really enjoy this? Like everybody has a different background. Some people are like, I love being a preacher's kid. I hate being a preacher's kid. Some people I love going to church. Some people I hate going to church. What was your perspective growing up?
So it was something that we did. I didn't really know any different. And I think we maybe went to the chapel when I was up till 3, like a base chapel. But then in South Carolina, it was just a life we lived. I didn't really know any better, but I didn't really pay attention, which I realized later in life. I think I was spiritually deaf, for lack of a better term, because the only thing I remember about church was rules. Don't screw up or you're going to get zapped, basically. The phrase that I remember most more than anything else was, you got to get right with God. And I don't know that anybody really knows how to do that, but that's what I believed I needed to do. And so I was constantly in fear of the lightning bolt coming down and zapping me in my spot, So that's kind of like how I felt about church and God. And it was just something you did. And I knew it was a good thing. And I believe that, I accepted Christ at a young age and lived the life that I was supposed to, but I didn't quite understand the message and the person of Jesus at the time. It was just kind of the concept, if that makes sense.
Oh, 100%. So going through your childhood, you already mentioned that in high school is when the story really starts, your personal journey, but all the things that happen to us, from birth to today, that makes us the men we are. So is there anything else in your childhood significant, again, good, bad, high, low, that happened between your birth and when we got to high school, or we just pick up the story there?
I think high school is kind of where the next turn kind of happens.
Okay.
But so I moved to Germany, and actually I went to high school for 2 years in Louisiana, and I took Marine Corps Junior ROTC, which is kind of like a military class, because I knew that I wanted to be in the military. I'd watched Indiana Jones movies and Rambo movies when I was a kid, and I wanted to be an archaeologist, but somebody told me that you would just be looking for dry bones in the desert, and that didn't seem too exciting. It wasn't going to be like the movies. So I kind of shifted more to the Rambo lifestyle, and I was like, well, I'm going to join the Army. That's what I'm going to do. So I did the 2 years of junior ROTC in the Marine Corps version of it. Then we went to Germany. I had like 2 years of Air Force ROTC. I effectively got out of PE classes, so I never had to take PE, which it was not my forte at all by doing that. And so I was basically gearing up to be in the military. So as soon as I graduated high school, I joined the Army, and I went to basic training in Fort Knox, Kentucky, to learn how to be a cavalry scout. And that is basically like a reconnaissance type job. Mind you, I had career military running all the way through to the Civil War and beyond. And so this was just kind of like a path for me. And most kids who went to high school in Germany, kind of this is the thing they did. But I was really into it. So I really wanted to do that. So I went to basic training, then I went to airborne school, which didn't quite work out for me. I ended up breaking my leg and not finishing the program. So I ended up getting shipped to Fort Polk, Louisiana, which they say is not the end of the world, but you can see it from there. It's kind of like one of the worst military installations to be stationed at.
Now, let me ask you a question. With the airborne training, is that something you wanted to do, or is that something you were kind of pushed in? Were you voluntold to do it, or did you want to do it?
No, you got to sign up for it. And I had a friend that graduated ahead of me, and you got paid $100 extra a month to jump out of airplanes. So I was like, that's what I want to do. I'm going to do that. I also went into the military with 2 grades higher than normal. It's an E3 instead of an E1, because I had taken the ROTC program. So I was getting paid more, and I was going to get paid a little more for the airborne portion of it. But since I broke my leg and I couldn't complete training, they just shipped me to a different unit. And then I was supposed to end up at. Yeah.
Skydiving then and skydiving now are 2 different events almost, right?
I'm sure. Yeah. And the military version is totally different. So
yeah. You jump out. Now, how many jumps did you have before you broke your leg?
I broke my leg running. I never.
Oh, you broke your leg running?
Yeah. So because I had never taken PE, I was kind of a scrawny kid. I was about let's see, 105 pounds, 5'10" when I graduated high school. So when I got to basic training, man, it was brutal. It's like 14 weeks straight of all the 4 years of PE that I never took all thrown at me at once. So I had these shin splints in my legs. And when I went to airborne school, one of the things you do is you run. And on one of the runs, like first weekend, my leg just broke. So except one of those stress fractures I had separated. So yeah, they put a cast on me and shipped me out.
Yeah. So you never even got to officially jump then?
No.
Oh man, I'm sorry to hear it. I love skydiving. I've only done it twice and I haven't done it to that degree, but man, I really enjoy it. But I know from the stories I hear from my friends, jumping out of a military aircraft, especially during a combat situation, is not the same as a luxury skydive where you land on, you slide in all nice and gentle.
Yeah, I'm sure.
So cool, man. So, okay. So you're in Germany, you got a history and a lineage that goes back all the way to the Civil War, which is incredible. You go to join, you go to the airborne school, you break your leg running, and now you're like, now what? Where does life go from there?
So I ended up at Fort Polk, which was I dated a girl in high school, and one of my goals was get married and join the Army, get married, and move on with my life. And so I ended up about 6 hours away from where she lived. So while I was at the Fort Polk area, I would on the weekends go visit her. And so what happened was, over time, long distance relationships don't seem to work out, and she ended up breaking up with me. And so I was super depressed and super sad, and had some friends that I was hanging out with, and they were telling me, come out, hang out with us, don't be sad. Let's go to these nightclubs and all this stuff. Now, up until this point, church kid, all that kind of stuff. I didn't smoke, drink, or chew, or hang out with girls that do, I didn't, mess around with anything. I was straight edge, straight lace, raised right and all that kind of stuff. But so I go out to these nightclubs with these guys, and somebody handed me something one night and said, take this, it'll make you feel better. And so I took this pill and swallowed it. I don't know what made me take it. I don't know what I was thinking, because I'd never done anything like that before. And it was a hit of ecstasy. And from that night forward, my life changed drastically. I could not get enough of this drug. It was insane, the effects that it was having on me. But, in hindsight and retrospect, it was basically an escape. I mean, it kind of took the pain and hurt away from the things that I was feeling, being separated from my family and having this heartbreak that I thought was, life changing and life altering, even though, now when I look back, it was, it's just a breakup, but it really messed me up. So next thing you know, I'm going to the club as much as possible to get a hold of this. And my friends are like, man, you get that pretty fast. And I was like, yeah, because, I know where to go get it from. And so they're like, well, how about if we just give you the money for us and you go get it? And so I was like, oh yeah, no problem. So next thing you know, I'm dealing drugs and I'm active duty Army, So the person that I was getting the drugs from was like, you're kind of moving a lot. So I'm going to start working with you, and I'm going to let you have some for free for selling this much. And so I became pretty much a middleman dealer. So eventually in the Army, when you do that kind of stuff, you can't get away with it for very long before your name starts popping up in the police, undercover type stuff. So there was a organization called CID, which is the Criminal Investigation Division of the Army. And they have like a drug suppression team, and my name started popping up in their office. So they started looking for me, and sooner or later they realized that I was causing a problem in the community, and they ended up pulling me over on the side of the road and finding some drugs on me and pulling me into their office. And I was like, I am in some serious trouble. I've never been in trouble before in my life. I don't even know what to do. And they told me, hey, you're going to jail. I'm just going to tell you that right now. But if you help us out, we'll help you out. And I was like, yeah, okay, no problem. That sounds good.
And not to cut you off, David, but for our listeners, we have listeners, as you know, all over the world, not just all over the country. You were looking at Army jail time, not civilian jail time, correct?
That is correct. Yes.
So explain the differences, because I had the honor and privilege of selling less lethal weapons and supporting our military and our law enforcement. I got to see a lot of correctional facilities, jails, prisons, and I know what those look like. But the Army is a whole different level. So explain the differences really quick so people can really appreciate the bind you were in.
So with the military, they have a totally different law system, and it's basically the UCMJ, which is the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and the rules that they have are completely different. You can go to jail for stuff that you can't go to jail for in the civilian world. But as far as the military jails are concerned, the difference is, you're not going to believe this, but they're a little bit better, because almost every single person that's in one of these jails has gone to high school, has a GED, and some sort of military training or background. So it's not like you're thrown into just like a wild, chaotic environment. However, everybody in there did something seriously wrong to get there. So it's like apples and oranges a little bit. But
There's not a consistent, like, the same people could do the same crime, and under the military system, they could get different years in prison. So it's not, it's so much more volatile. And like you're saying, maybe the conditions within are a little safer, but you don't know what you're going to get when you're tried. Correct?
That is 100% true. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It really,
it's up to the judge.
If you had a bad golf game and he's the one passing your sentence, you could be screwed.
Exactly. That is true.
All right. So pick up. I didn't mean to cut you off, but I want to make sure our listeners understand there's a big difference in America alone within the judicial system.
Yeah. So I was basically arrested. I was under surveillance, and I was like, you know what? Screw that guy. I'm going to continue doing what I'm doing. So I went and got another big shipment of drugs, and me and the dealer, and we were at her trailer. And that night the door blew open, all these cops come running in, they're like, nobody move. And I was like, oh, I'm in trouble again. But they took her away because the drugs were in her room, and they took her boyfriend away. She was a civilian, he was military. So they took him on base, they took her to jail, and then the cop who arrested me was like, dude, what's going on? I thought you were gonna help us out. And I kind of played it off like I had no idea what was going on. And he told me to get back to get back on post, which is basically the military base. And he was going to talk to me the next day. So I head back there, and then I get a phone call from the boyfriend, who calls me and says he escaped because he was doing a urinalysis, and the guy who was supposed to be watching him was in the other stall, and he ran. And so he calls me and he says, come get me. So I grabbed my stuff, got in the car, picked him up, and basically moved to Houston, Texas. So I ran away from the Army that night and stayed gone for 6 months with a lot of stuff that's detailed in the book. But
yeah, let's pause there for a second, because you had to make a choice, and you made a choice not just to defect from the military and go AWOL, but you also made a choice to run away with a felon and someone who was going to be facing serious jail time. So now that implicates you more in the crime. What at that point were you thinking? Like, did you know this gentleman very well? Were you just like, what were you thinking to make that type of decision?
The only thing I was thinking was I was going to go to jail, which they told me I was. And now with this mess, it was just going to get worse, because it looked like I wasn't really willing to help, which I wasn't. And so I think I was just looking for an escape. And I was like, I don't know, with what I hear, at the time, what I heard about jail and prison, I was like, I will not survive. There's no way. So I'm not going. Just that it was self-preservation, I think, was the biggest motive. And also just, the fact that I was using so many drugs and doing drugs so frequently that I feel like I just needed to be able to have that instead of the reality of life.
All right, man. So now you go and you pick them up, you leave your post. Where does life take you from there?
So I moved to Houston, Texas, and in Houston, I was able to, I had done some dealings with the dealer that my dealer was getting her drugs from. So I kind of hooked up with them, and there's a lot that happened, too much to go into, but basically I ended up living in this drug dealer's apartment because he got arrested, and I kind of took his spot in the tier. So as I'm getting drugs from the people he was getting drugs from, I started going back to Fort Polk and selling them like an idiot because I just ran away from there, So over a 6-month period, I'm driving back and forth between Houston, Texas, and Fort Polk, Louisiana, and buying quantities of drugs and then going there and selling them and going back and forth, just basically to survive, because I didn't have a job other than that, and also to fund my habit, because the further I went along, the more and more I started to take, to the point where I was self-medicated almost every single day. So I was under the influence of every single type of drug you can possibly think of, with the exception of a needle, most nights. And I drove around like that. I walked around like that. And I used that as a form of, a way to live as far as compensations goes. So
And
it got
roughly, how old were you at this point?
19, 19 years old.
So you're 19. And did you have any communication with your family, your mom, your dad? Was there any kind of connection, or were you completely disconnected at this point?
I did call him and tell him I got in trouble, but because my father was in the Air Force still, active duty, if he knew where I was and didn't turn me in, then he could be implicated with harboring a military fugitive. So I never told him where I was exactly, and I never left any way for them to communicate with me. So I just would touch base with them from time to time, just kind of let them know I was still alive. And it really, as I look back, just super selfish. And if anybody who's listening understands addiction at all, it's a very selfish disease. People will do anything for a high and don't care who or what they take from, emotionally, financially. It's a bad deal.
Okay. So now you're in Texas. You're not only dealing drugs, but you're an addict. You're taking huge, crazy risks going back to where you fled from. And where does the story go from there, David?
So it got to the point where so many different types of drugs in my system all the time. I actually ended up overdosing one night, and I still couldn't get my act together. But there was an incident where I was in the trailer and I had 100 hits of ecstasy, and normally with that I would just put it in one big bag and go into
100 hits.
Yeah, that was just to sell. I wasn't using that many.
I'm like, holy crap. No wonder why you overdosed.
No, yeah, I would be dead for sure.
Yeah. Okay. Just you explain the average effects of ecstasy on a user again, just so they have a frame of reference, because that's a very strong drug. It's like a club drug, but it can kill you and it can have really strong side effects. But it gives people a kind of a concept, since that was your main drug of choice. What would the average hit of ecstasy do to someone?
So it's really hard to tell because you don't know who's making it, where it's coming from, but it's basically an amphetamine and it's kind of a speed type thing, but there's this euphoric effect that you get from it. So it makes you feel like you're in love with life and everybody loves you and everybody loves each other. So it does definitely take away any kind of life pain that you might be experiencing. It only lasts a few hours, and the more you take it, the it doesn't last as long, So the first time I took it, I felt like I was high on it for probably the entire night. It could have been 3 to 4 hours, but after that, it seemed like it would only last me about an hour or so, and I had to take more. And then I was afraid of coming down from it, so I would just continually take in order for me never to actually come down from the drug. Because when I was completely off the drugs, my life was a mess. I couldn't, it was guilt, shame, and then just the physiological effects of not having the drugs in my system. It was too much to bear. So I just stayed pretty much self-medicated all the time.
Yeah, and there is a lot of side effects to that drug, if I'm correct too. I mean, I know people who've taken that, men and women. One girl, and I was working at a restaurant chain. Chick took it and broke her back, like from just the intensity of it. Yeah. And then I know a lot of people they take it with the intent of, what's the word? Like enhancing their sexual experience, but then they can't have good sexual experiences after that in real life without the drug. Is that some of the stuff that you know of people using and having an effect?
Yeah, for me, it was just like, could I get as high to the sky as possible? It was just like chasing the high. I started mixing with LSD, cocaine, crystal meth, marijuana, alcohol, all of the stuff I'd never even done before. So I was just like, whatever somebody had, I would trade for it or experiment with. And it was just every night was just kind of a different situation. So
anything just to keep that high going. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right.
And just not be in reality at all whatsoever. Yeah.
Okay. So where do we go from here now?
So I've got this 100 hits of ecstasy, and my crime partner at the time is the guy that I got arrested with. He's got some LSD. And normally with LSD, you take it and you put it in a little bag so that you're not supposed to touch it. Otherwise, you can absorb it in your system. So we have all these little baggies, and we had this leftover bags. And I'd always told people if I got arrested, I was going to consume everything that I had and just go out, because I'm not going to jail. I'm not letting them take me down. No way, Jose. So for some reason, I'd never done this before, but this particular night, I decided, hey, we got these extra bags. Why don't I just stick all these ecstasy pills in these bags? So I had 100 individually wrapped pills of ecstasy in this big bag, and I had it in my jacket, and we decided to go to the club. So we're in the club, and then a friend of mine comes running in, and he goes, "Dude, I just heard in the parking lot you're about to get busted." So the CID, the Army undercover cops, knew I was, they'd been watching for me. They knew I was going to be there that night. So they were coming in to get me. And I was like, oh my gosh, I was going to take all the drugs if they ever caught me, but I can't, because this night I put all these pills in these bags. And I'm 100% positive that that was divine intervention, because I had never done that before. And so the very night that I'm getting arrested, I do this weird thing with the drugs, making it impossible for me to consume all the drugs. So the cops grab me. I throw the jacket on the ground with the drugs in it. So my friend grabbed my jacket, ran to the bathroom, and threw it in the garbage. And so the cops never actually were able to arrest me with all of those drugs, because she kind of watched it and ended up, that those drugs disappeared down the road. But they took me outside. They had me up against the wall, guns, and everything. And they were sure they were going to bust me with all these drugs, and they didn't have any. I didn't have any on me for them to arrest me with, but because I was AWOL, they were able to arrest me because of that. So they took me to this local jail, put me in there until the next day they were going to come and pick me up. The Army guys were going to pick me up. And I just remember laying there in bed going, I've screwed up my life. My life is over. This is it. And I'm just laying there, feeling sorry for myself, praying to God, get me out of this. But it wasn't time. So they took me back to my unit, and they told me, if we put you back in the barracks instead of in jail, or will you run away? I'm like, no, I'll just hang out, wait for my trial. My dad was supposed to come to my trial, which in hindsight, I got my father, who's in the military, coming to his son's military trial on request. And, that probably didn't go well with his commander and being embarrassed and all that. But my dad, he's a good guy. He's like, I'll do whatever I need to do for my son. But for some reason, something happened with the court date, and he wasn't going to be able to make it. So I freaked out and I ran away again. And I disappeared for about a week. And I went to Dallas, where some of my friends who used to be in the Army got out, and I hung out with them. And I didn't know this at the time, but there was a whole bunch of people praying for me. My mom, I had her friends, and my dad, they had all these people praying for me. And I had this huge sensation feeling that I needed to turn myself in. And I get a phone call from the cop, and come to find out later, because I've had communications with the cop, that he was a Christian, and he had kind of a change of heart. I kind of burned him a little bit, and he was going to just let me sink myself. But he said something told him to help me out. So he said he was going to help me out. So he gives me a call. He found out where I was hiding out at. He gives me a call and says, it's going to be better if you turn yourself in. And so with this overwhelming sense of like, I need to just get this over with, I ended up driving back to Fort Polk and turning myself in.
And then when you're doing that, you're driving, you're bringing yourself to turn yourself in. Of course, Satan's always going to try to put in your head, oh, don't do it, turn around, run again. Was it a hard drive bringing yourself to do this? Or at that point, had you just resolved this is what needs to be done?
Well, kind of interestingly, before I drove to Dallas, Texas, the drug dealer I was living with gave me a gun and said, I need to get rid of this anyways, but take it with you. And because I was like, I'm not going to jail. And I decided that if I ever got caught, if somebody were to catch me, this time I would do suicide by cop, where you pull a gun out and have them shoot you and stuff like that. So I was ready to just go away for forever. And when I was driving back to Fort Polk, a pin fell out of my drive shaft. So here I'm going to turn myself in, and my car breaks. And it's in the middle of the night, and I'm driving from Dallas, Texas to Fort Polk, Louisiana. I think it's like a 6-hour drive. And I was like, what am I going to do? I'm ready to turn myself in. So I looked in my glove box, and I don't know why, but I had a firing pin, which is just like a little metal stick, basically, that hits the bullet, makes the bullet fly out of the gun, right? I had one of those in my glove box. So I took the firing pin and I stuck it in the drive shaft where the little screw fell out. And I drove and got it in 5th gear, and I heard the pin fall out. So I drove, it must have been about 3 hours through every stop sign, stoplight. I couldn't stop because I wouldn't be able to get the car going again, all the way into right outside of the drug dealer's house that I was living with. And I parked the car and turned it off and waited in the morning for the cop to come pick me up. So I was resolved to turn myself back in. And along the way, I pitched the gun out somewhere on the side of the road and the bullets separately. I just was throwing things out the window. It was kind of crazy, a little bit crazy. Yeah.
Man, all right. So now you're at this drug dealer's house. You're waiting for the officer who had a change of heart, because obviously God is with you and inspiring them through the Holy Ghost to help you out. Where does life go from there?
So then it was time for me actually to, face the music, go to my trial. And my dad ended up coming to Fort Polk. So he had to, sit there in my trial and be a character witness for me. But the cop that arrested me while I was waiting for the trial, I was sitting in jail. I told him that I would help him out. So he actually took me out of jail, and I did a drug bust, and I took a drug dealer down. We actually went to Houston with some local law enforcement and from Texas and Louisiana, and did a drug bust and took down the dealer that I was buying drugs from. So that actually worked in my favor when I had my trial, because I assisted. So I get to my trial, and I'm facing 38 years with all the charges, and they ended up giving me a 5-year sentence because of my cooperation. They took all my rank away from me, so I went from the rank that I had all the way down to nothing. And they gave me a dishonorable discharge, which is like the lowest discharge you can get, and being labeled a dishonorable man by the U.S. government for life, basically. So I ended up having to go to Fort Leavenworth eventually, which is like the Army prison. It's a maximum security prison. I was there for basically about 3 years, and before I ended up getting out. And while I was in there, I worked in a dining facility as a job. I kind of worked in, basically, it's like they call it a mess hall, but basically it's the restaurant for the inmates. I wanted to work in a barbershop. I thought something as a side gig I used to do in the Army was like cut hair on the side, and I tried to get in there, and that was one thing I was like, I don't want to be in the mess hall. I just want to be in the barbershop, or maybe a chaplain's assistant, or work in the library. And they stuck me in the mess hall, so that's where I worked. And then while I was there, I had to take a bunch of programs, like Anonymous, drug and alcohol related incidences, reality therapy, anger management. I didn't think I was angry, but I guess they thought I was angry or something. But just a bunch of classes I had to take in order for me to be eligible to get out. So I did a lot of that. And then I had different custody levels I had to go through. But prison itself, I can't explain it exactly. If you said you've been in these facilities, but it's a dark, not in the air, but it's like a depressing, oppressive, lonely, miserable place. You have no freedom, no control. And I was suffering from, drug withdrawals and anxiety and like panic attacks and things like that. And just a lot of time I'm sitting and thinking about all the things that I've done. And I remember looking out my window, and this is, it's a military prison. So outside there's this huge American flag staring at me, I'm just feeling the disgrace of having dishonored, my family, my country, the Army, and God. It was just very hard to sit there. I mean, and I own up to everything I did. So I'm not saying that anybody should feel sorry for me, but it was just a lot to think about. So the whole time I'm sitting in this jail cell, not being able to get out, I just realized what a mess I made in my life, and how bad my decisions were, and how they affected other people. So yeah, it was not fun.
And as you're going through this, you're taking these classes, you're working in the mess hall, your last choice for, employment while you're incarcerated. And then you said you're about 3.5 years in. Where at this point are you in your relationship with God? Have you start the journey where you're having a relationship and communicating with him again, or is that coming forward in your story?
That's a little bit more forward in the story. I was still loosely attached, and I would go to the chapel just at times just to kind of get out of doing certain things. If you go there, you don't have to do this other thing, so, and I kind of sort of wanted to connect with God, but I didn't know exactly how. I just still kind of had a lot of guilt and shame, and it was overpowering, and it was like a barrier between the relationship that I needed to have with God. But I did have a moment where I was in the dining facility, and as we're in this dining facility, they have an area where people would eat, and then there's the kitchen. So me and this guy were over in the one side mopping the floors, and he walks up to me and he goes, "Hey, I want to show you something." And he holds out his hand, and he's got 2 little white pieces of paper, and I recognize it immediately as LSD. And I'd been sober for about 2.5 years, about 2 years, 2.5 years. So I took one of them, and I don't know if he was offering it to me or just showing it to me, but it's out of just a reflex. I took one. So he ended up taking his, and then we're tripping on LSD in a prison dining facility. So we somehow make it through the entire day with nobody really catching on to what we did. And I went back to my barracks, and I was actually coming up on my first potential parole. And in order to have a parole hearing, you have to have this packet put together. And I was waiting on a few more things. And one thing I was waiting for was a letter from my dad. That was like the final piece that I would be able to submit my packet, with like a place to work, a place to live, family support, stuff like that. Right. So I'm waiting for this letter. So the night that I relapsed on drugs, I get this letter and I open it up. It finally arrived that same night. I open it up, and in there is my dad stated that he would stake his reputation, his job, and his life on the fact that I would never do drugs again. So again, I feel like another God orchestrated moment was showing me that had he actually had to put all of it up, for collateral, then I would have been basically taking him down. And then it was that moment where I just lost it, and I realized this has got to stop. And so I swore off drugs for life at that moment. I've never, other than ibuprofen and things like that, I've never partaken in any type of mind altering stuff again. So that was pretty pivotal, I think, as well. But to get into the God thing, I finally made it to the highest custody level, which is basically you're not in the prison anymore. You're kind of like in this barracks, and you're allowed to have a radio, which is kind of like a privilege, instead of listening to the prison radio system, which is like a jack on the wall with headphones. And I'm scrolling through one night, and I'm listening to this preacher talking, and I don't usually listen to this kind of stuff, but he asked these people call in and ask questions about faith and stuff, and this guy calls and he's talking to him. So this preacher says, when Jesus died for our sins, how many of them were in the future? And I was like, that's something I never really thought about before. And he said all of them, since he died like 2,000 years ago. So he died for all of your sins, like every sin that you would commit before you were born, and he still decided to die for you, knowing that you were going to do that. And my mind was blown at that moment, because I never thought about it like that. I just kind of thought, like, screw up, you get zapped. Your life won't be good if you don't get right with God. And that's something I don't think we ever can actually do on our own. And then I started reading through the Bible. So my parents had sent me a Bible, a study Bible, and I'm reading through it. And all of a sudden I start seeing these verses pop up, and it's explaining grace and redemption. And these words that you hear in church when you grow up, but you don't know what they mean until you've had to live under them, And so I read a verse that said, it was 2 Corinthians 5:19. For God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself, no longer counting people's sins against them. And that was super powerful, because he doesn't, like, I screwed up big time, and I mean, there are other people who screwed up worse than me, less than me, but it's all the same. Like, sin is what keeps you having a relationship with God. And then another one was Romans 8:1, which is my favorite verse in the whole Bible. So now there is no condemnation for those who belong to Christ Jesus. So I was in a state of condemnation by the U.S. military, sitting in prison, dishonorable discharge, drug dealer, scourge of the earth, scum, all these labels that I'm putting on myself. And God's looking at me going, you're my son, just like my father did when he stood up in my trial. You're my son, and I'll do anything for you. And I would just want to have a relationship with you. And it was crazy. And I feel like as I was reading the Bible, it was like it was being rewritten for me right in front of my face. It was mind blowing.
And that was something when we read our Bible. I mean, it's the word of God. It's, in the beginning was the word, and the word was with God, and the word was God. Word is God. So it's so important. But for someone who's not ready to accept it, I still think, read the Bible as much as you can, and you're going to come to see truth. But you were just at that point, you heard on the radio that preacher say, Jesus forgave all the sins, all the future sins that you're going to do, because he already forgave them all, because that was 2,000 years ago. So to people listening who, they listen to this show for all sorts of reasons, but at the end result, it's to grow and to be better people. For those listeners who don't have a relationship with God, what advice do you have for them right now?
You mean like the secular view of?
Yeah, like they're like, man, I love listening to your show, Dave, and David. I'm glad you're on here today, and the information you're giving it's interesting, and I know, it's giving me. We're getting to the practical steps of how to overcome more, but I just don't believe in God. I just don't have that faith. So someone caught your attention, and then it brought you into this journey of searching out for a relationship with your true Father. But for someone listening now who's on the fence and they're like, should I even waste my time on that? Should I invest my time on that? What message do you have to them?
Well, it would be really hard for me to separate faith from my story because there were so many clear instances where it's too coincidental to be a coincidence. But I do know that had I in the military, they have things in place for people, especially now more than ever before, especially with people coming back with PTSD and trying to figure out how to deal with that. But had I just reached out to somebody and said, "Hey, I'm struggling," I think that would have been a bit beneficial. But I didn't, and I don't think that was my path. I have regrets, but I can't live in regret. I've got to move forward. So, but if I could go back, I think one of the things I would have done was reach out and said, "Hey, I'm struggling. I need help," instead of going to drugs, which was just a random occurrence, which altered my life forever. So I think just reaching out, and I think that as men, especially, I think men have a tendency to think I've got this. I have to be tough. I'm secure. I'm the rock, and you're not. Like, we're all human beings, and we're going to make mistakes, and there are people out there who want to help you. You just got to reach out. I think that's probably about the closest thing I can say is finding a community of people who care about you, who are willing to invest in you, who would be similar, to the God thing, but without God being in it. I just can't separate the two myself.
Yeah, we shouldn't separate. There's nobody.
Yeah.
God's not separated from anything. God, I don't care if you're a business person, if you're a janitor, if you're a rocket scientist, God's in everything. I mean, if it works because of God. So I wasn't asking you to separate at all.
Oh, yeah.
But when it comes to your journey of knowing God, that's what really brought the healing from what you're saying.
Oh, yeah.
So that's what I was saying. For someone who's sitting there hurting, but they just can't get it through their thick skull, what is the healing? What is the solution? What advice do you have for them about the Bible, about the gospel, about God?
The one thing I think, if you can't forgive yourself, you need somebody else to forgive you. I mean, God is the answer. I mean, God has forgiven us all, and He actually sent His Son to die for everything we've ever done. So that's the most powerful thing you probably believe. And one of the coolest things, the guy that I was listening to on the radio, his name was Bob George, and he's since passed away. But his book was called Classic Christianity, and I poured through that book, and that it was full of some really cool information. But one of the cool things that really helped out was, if you are a parent and you have a child and your child screws up and your kid comes to you and says, "I'm so sorry," and you're like, "Son or daughter, I forgive you. Don't worry about it. We're good." Right? And then your child comes back, "No, really, I'm sorry. I can't get this off my chest." And you're like, "No, I forgave you yesterday. You're good. Everything's good. We're good to go." And then they come back again. And I think as Christians, we have a tendency to do that. We're always like, "Please forgive me," or "I hope I'm saved." I just can't let this go. And God's like, I took care of that. It's gone. It's gone forever. I don't even have it in my mind anymore. And that was something that I got out of that book, which is kind of what I'm hoping that my book will do for people, because the life change that I had, I knew who God was, and I knew who Christ was, and I knew what He had done, but I didn't really understand it until I heard those things. And that's my goal, is to kind of give people the same experience that I had through my story. So
beautiful. Yeah. And a real relationship, church doesn't save anybody. A relationship with Christ does. And that, I mean, life's all about. It's about glorifying God, loving God, because He first loved us. And, have peace with God, have peace with ourselves, love God, love others. That's life in a nutshell. And that's where we're going to feel peace, joy, and contentment, connected. That's where everything people want really is. So talk about this, David. You're listening to the radio. You hear this gentleman talk. You say it was Bob George?
Mm-hmm.
So Bob George, he's given you this information, catches your attention, and now you're still incarcerated, even though it's to a lower level. Where does life go from there?
So at that point, I was really soaking up the word and being like it. Another thing I would like to explain too, in this custody level, there was a lot of peace that I was outside of the prison wall, so the air was fresh, life was fresh. It was I was still incarcerated, but I had a little taste of freedom. I actually got a chance to come home for 1 week while I was in prison, and I got a real taste of freedom. Had to go back to prison, and then finally I decided I had two choices. I could stay in there to the end of my sentence, or I could take parole. And I finally, that first parole that I was telling you about, I got denied. But the second time, I decided I'm going to go ahead and take this parole because I don't want to be in prison one more day. I don't care how slightly free it feels. I need out. I'm ready to go be a productive member of society, take on life, and with this newfound faith, and move forward. So I took parole, moved to Omaha, Nebraska, which is where I live now. I ended up going to hair school because that was the thing that I wanted to do. I wanted to cut hair for a living. Eventually, I became a teacher. I had a big struggle trying to find a job when I first got out because you got that little box you got to check. Have you ever been convicted of a felony? Please explain. People wouldn't even answer my phone calls or wouldn't even look at my applications, and I got turned down face to face in a restaurant by a guy. And then I finally decided, you know what? I'm going to go into this retail store and I'm going to fill out the application, but I'm going to go. I want to talk to the manager. So the manager comes and says, "Yeah, I heard you want a job." And I'm like, "Yeah, let me just be forward with you. I just got out of jail basically just like a week ago, but I guarantee you, if you hire me, I'm going to be the hardest working guy you got here. I just need a chance." And he's like, "Okay." Like that face to face interaction, I think he could tell this guy's looking, he's serious. So, for anybody who struggles with your past, sometimes it can really be finding a job is one of the reasons why people go back to prison, because they can't find a job and they go back to the old stuff that caused them to get there. And I was blessed because I had family support. I was able to live with my parents, and that kind of stuff. Not everybody has that, but definitely, got that job, went to hair school, eventually met my wife, who I'm married to now. And, we started a family and life was good until 9/11. And then 9/11 happened, and my brother had just joined the Air Force, and he ends up doing 4 tours in Afghanistan. And I was struggling with the fact that I had not finished my military service with honor. And I was really struggling. I was doing life. I don't know that I was as connected to God as I was when I was was at the end of my prison sentence. But I saw people in the country just running off to, go fight for the, good of man, regardless of your political idea of, war and all that kind of stuff. It wasn't about war. It was just people wanted to do good, but I wasn't even allowed because of this dishonorable discharge that I had. And so I was dealing with a lot of guilt and shame and depression, and was wondering, teaching. I was a teacher at the hair school at the time, and I'm like, am I even making a difference? Is this really worth anything? What's going on? So then I remembered that book I read, and I had to really remember that my life was valuable because, God died for me, or Jesus died for me, and I could be a productive member of society. And maybe it's not in the military, but I don't have to live with that guilt and shame anymore because I am forgiven. So that's the biggest thing that I needed to remember, is that I was forgiven. And that's kind of an ongoing journey, I think, for most people, because you're never going to live a perfect life. There was only one person who did, and we know who that was.
And then once you had this kind of you had to face it, and then God brought back the memory of that book, and it kind of puts you back in balance and perspective of, what you're meant to do and be. And, we can choose our sin, but we can't choose our consequences. Right. So
Right.
Now you're picking up and, hey, I'm moving forward the best I can today. And, learning from the past, but not dwelling in it. Where does your life go from there, David?
So I'm teaching hair school, doing my thing, being a dad, got awesome kids, awesome wife, and I tell people from time to time, they're like, yeah, I would say in little pieces of conversation, my past would kind of pop up, and they're like, "You did what? You were where?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I served some time in prison for being a drug dealer." And they're like, "What?" And then I would tell a little bit about my story, and they're like, "You should write a book." And I was like, I don't think not sure even how I got out of high school, much less write a book. I don't think I could do that. But I follow a guy called John Acuff, and he was working for the Dave Ramsey company at the time that I stumbled across his material. And he decided to do this challenge where all these people got together and kind of helped each other do something that they wanted to do in their life, using kind of a social networking type way to do it. And I wrote in this group that I think I want to tell my story about serving time in prison. And they're like, "Oh, well, you should start a blog. Do that first." I was like, "Oh, that's a great idea." So I started a blog, and once a week I started to write my story, and people started reacting to it. And it didn't go viral, like TikTok goes viral, but it was spreading. And people were starting to reach out to me and "You're helping me understand what my child went through. You're helping me understand, what my husband went through or what I went through. And people started reaching out to me. And then people that I knew were like, hey, just so you know, I also served time. Like, what? And it was just opening up all these conversations. And it was really cool because my story, as messy as it was being used by God to reach out to people and help them know that they weren't alone. And then at the end of a 3-year period of blogging, I ended up compiling it and then putting it into a book form. So then I launched this book, and I had a little launch group of about 750 people in a little Facebook group who had followed the blog all along, and they helped me get the word out. And then I got to see this book being, selfies being taken to this book all over the world, and it was really cool. But the really cool thing was that I decided that as a ministry that I would ship books to inmates for free. So anybody ever said, I got somebody in prison who I'd like to send a copy to, I'm like, just give me an address, and I'd ship them a copy. And I've gotten to see a lot of people affected by my story in a positive way because of that. I even have 2 or 3 books that actually ended up in Fort Leavenworth, which is kind of cool because that's where I was. And more recently, over the past 3 years, there is a cosmetology school in a women's prison in Oklahoma. And when the class graduates, I send a copy to the entire graduating class. So each one gets a copy. And this last one, I think, was about 23 people get a copy of my book, which is relatable because they're in prison and they're doing hair. And they're going to come out trying to find a job. And it just all, it all works together. And so I'm just super excited about the fact that my story gets used this way. And I don't take any credit for it at all because I know God's hand is on it completely. I just recently also had a student tell me that after reading my story, one of my current students, that she turned her life back over to Christ after reading my book. And that's, you can't get any better than that. It's just one person meets Jesus through your story. It's worth it.
100%, man. I'm so glad to share this time with you. It is an honor, and to hear your story and to see you're sharing it and giving the glory to God, because it all is His. Our failures are on us. All the success is on God, right?
Yeah.
So let me ask you this now. You said a couple things. This is where I want to park, have a real kind of teaching moment where you break down your successes. So number one, you didn't just you were looking for what the next step was. That group helped you to find it, but you had to take action.
Mm-hmm.
So I want you to address the listeners about taking action, what's some steps to get started or finding what you should be starting. And then also, I want to point this out. When David was speaking, did you catch it took 3 years? Not everything happens overnight. The average millionaire takes 7 to 9 years, right? The average overnight success. When people say, oh, they're an overnight success. No. On average, statistically, it takes 7 to 9 years of hard work to become that overnight success. So David, he committed to writing that blog and building his group out to, you said 750 when the book launched, which is great. That's a great community, but it took work and time, and every moment was super happy and exciting, David, right? No discouragement at all.
It was hard. So what happened was I put the blog together, and every single thing that I did through this group of people, the original group had about 3,000 people in it that were all kind of doing different things. Some of them wanted to be like life coaches or a Disney planner or, chef or, change the career that they're in. Everybody had their different goal. Mine was just, I just want to tell my story. But all these people that I had been in this group with had the experience. And so my first step was I went to a conference and this guy said, you need to get off your ask. So what that means is don't be afraid to ask people, because there's people out there who have done the thing and are willing to coach you or help you, usually for free. And obviously there could be some investment involved, but at this time, everything I did, I got free advice and help from people who had done it before. So that was my first step, was just asking. And I started blogging, and this woman reached out to me. She goes, hey, can I help you? Because the way that you're describing your story, I can tell is very powerful, but the way you're writing it is not. So she was saying, how did you feel? As a male, I'm like, I did this and I did this. So she actually coached me. So I would send her through Evernote. I would send a copy of my weekly blog to her. She would look through and say, and then, with some advice, I would kind of take out all the I's, and restructure that. And then you need to tell me how you felt. And so I had to really dig into my emotions, which is really hard for me because I'm not like an overly emotional guy. So there was that, the coaching process, and then just understanding all the aspects that go into blogging and that kind of stuff. I just learned it all as I went along. And so that's what helped it grow. But constantly reaching out and being educated by the people and reaching out to people who already know how to do it and them feeding into me and giving me the information. But it took 3 years for me to get all of the story out. And then I had an editor actually, take the book on also and edit it for me. She helped me with the launch team. So I'm really big on, if you want to do something, you have to reach out to the people who know how to do it. And there's courses you can take and things like that. But generally, you're going to find somebody in your community or your circle who's willing to just give you a hand.
So where would you recommend people are listening now? They're getting encouraged. They're like, man, I was just about to quit. David's talking about this. Where do you recommend they start to find these experts? Because everybody will do it for money. And that doesn't mean they're any better than the people who will donate their time just because they want to see you succeed. So where's a starting point you'd recommend for most people trying to get off their ass?
I would say that generally you're going to be able to find a Facebook group of people of like-minded. So if you're wanting to be an author, there are Facebook groups for authors that there's free advice available. If you want to be, a life coach, they have Facebook groups of people who do life coaching who are willing to, and eventually you're going to have to put a little bit of skin in the game, I believe, and maybe a little bit of investment. But I started with nothing and ended up being able to do this without putting it really any money in it at all. So I would say Facebook is a great opportunity, but also you would have like local chapters or communities, community events and things like that in your probably your hometown of people who maybe local authors, go to a bookstore and they have local author signings. I would say reach out to people who have done it before and knowing what it is you want to do and seeking out people who are great at it. And maybe even just saying, hey, I'll take you out to dinner if you just explain the process, or can I pay you for your time? And that would be one way to get somebody who is an expert in the field you're wanting to go into. So those are ways that I would say be easy to reach out.
Good, man. And then do you have any tips for identifying the experts?
Well, it would be hard without knowing exactly what field. But so for like an author who's a New York Times bestselling author would be somebody who could be considered an expert in authoring because they were able to get that book published and are able to sell it. So I would say that's one way. And I'm kind of using that avenue because that's the path I went.
Yeah. And another thing too is there aren't many authors who make a living off writing books. So when you are inspired, like David, to write a book, we just wrote a book for the Remarkable People podcast, the first of the year, but we're doing it to reach souls, not to make money. So sales to us equals souls, not sales equals
Correct.
Success. Because I think the average nonfiction book, they say, sells only 250 copies in its lifetime. Now, granted, that's the standard that the publishing companies and KDP and Amazon and others tell you. So I personally think a lot more copies are sold, but they're just not paid for. I think that the publishers pocket that money, but statistically they say for nonfiction, 250 copies are sold. So even if you made $2 or $3 a book, it's not about the money, and you need that mindset going into it. It has to be a passion. And then you might reach 2 million people with your book. You might reach 200,000 people with your book. You might reach 10,000. You just need to know going in, you do your best and let God bring the increase, because the numbers would be discouraging if that's all you're focused on. Would you agree or disagree, David?
I agree. And if you're going to be an author and you want to live off that, you actually have to have multiple streams of income. So you're going to be speaking, you're going to be, you're going to be writing books. You're going to have like merchandise. There's a whole bunch of different ways to make money. But again, me and you were kind of doing it for the same reason. And not only that, the cool thing is that books like mine and yours get passed around. So even without the sale, and I can't even tell you how many books I've given away. If somebody's struggling, I'm like, you know what, you need a copy of my book. I'm just going to give it to you, or ship it to somebody. It's totally worth the payout on my end to be able to reach somebody with my story, even if they can't afford it.
Yeah, 100%. I just wanted to make sure a lot of people, they want to write books. It's like a life dream. It's the same thing as a podcast. People want a podcast, but then they get into it and they see how much work it is and they quit.
It's a lot of work.
Yeah, there's more people that run marathons, 26 miles, than there are people who publish a book a year. So I just want you to have real, I guess, balance in your mental image. Like David had a story, God laid it on his heart to share it. He got involved in the experts. He took the steps. He didn't know all the steps, but he took the next step, and God just kept leading him down the right path to the right people. And God will do that for you too, if it's his will. So make sure you're taking the steps. But if your expectation is to be rich, famous, Indiana Jones, fortune and glory, you're in it for the wrong reason. Don't even bother starting. Because if you're trying to get fortune and glory, you're just going to end up another idiot in the White House, right? Like totally useless, no life skills, no life experience. You're not helping anybody but yourself. So if you're trying to be selfless, go ahead and write that book. That's my public service announcement. If it's too harsh, forgive me. But David, you can tell me I'm wrong or right, whatever you want. But
I agree with you. And like I said, if you're going to be an author, you have to have multiple streams of income, because unless you're Stephen King, there's only so many of those out there.
Yeah, it's the anomaly, and it's not the norm. So, and he writes fiction, which people don't want to live in reality. They want to read nonfiction, right? They want to read about fairy tales and ghosts and demons and cats that come out of the cemetery. So, anyways, let's get back to your story. So you get together with this group, you find the right team, you commit. You had 750 people on your launch team, which is great. And now the book releases. Bring us between there and today.
So the book, I couldn't tell you exactly how many books have sold. I've looked, and it's kind of sketchy because they switched from one platform to the other recently. But I would say I think I've probably anywhere 3,000 to maybe 4,000 copies haven't been printed. Because some of them I would order and then sell individually. But I would say, in a 6-year period, that's pretty good for a self-published. I self-published it as well. I had to create a LLC and a publishing company so that I could maintain the rights and everything. I own my own ISBN number. There were so many things, and like you were saying, every time I would take the next step, I'm like, okay, what's the next step? And then somebody would tell me how to do it. So, and I definitely had a really good core group of people that just were kind of like surrounding me, like, I want to see this happen. And it's because God put it all together,
Yeah.
And I said,
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off. There was a delay. 3,000 to 4,000 copies is amazing. And people need to understand that, again, it's still a labor of love, because you have to sign the co-author agreements, or you got to get the copyright attorney, or you got to get, like you said, it costs money for those little barcodes and ISBN numbers. Yeah. Everything costs money. So if you write a book these days, like David's saying, you have to do it for the passion, the love, and the desire to help, because the income for most people isn't going to be there unless you're the anomaly.
Yeah, I agree 100%.
Yeah. So now you're learning this, the book's out there, you're selling copies. What's life like for you today, David?
And in the beginning, I was in the newspaper, I was on the radio, people would share it, and I spoke at some churches and some, different community groups. And then as the time went on, that kind of slowed down, and now it's just more like word of mouth. As far as the book's concerned, I'd kind of bring it up, my story, in person to some of my students, people I work with, people I go to church with. And then people like you allow me on their podcast. This is my first one this year. I did 1 or 2 last year, and I'll reach out if the platform seems like it makes sense. And I still am able to get my story out there 6 years later. And so it's been really cool. And actually it's been 9 years, because I started the blog, 3 years before I wrote it. So, I'd say the story has been circulating for about 9 years now, officially, since that first blog post.
Yeah. And I think David and I are both the same, where our stories are little circles, and there's, billions of people, billions of stories, but they all circle around the main circle, and that's God. And that's correct. His story. And that's all Dave and I are trying to share with you, is all the hope, all the joy, all the peace, all the success. Even when you have failures and hardship and sickness, when you're with God, you have peace and joy. And that's something money can't buy and drugs can't bring you. So let me do this too. Little steps, like me and you, we met. Explain to the listeners how you and I met. Because that's, like, to me, there are no coincidences, and, all these things tie together. And now you're a guest on the show.
And I can't remember how I stumbled on your podcast. I just know that I listened to it. And I don't know if somebody else was on there that I was interested in. And then I'm like, oh, they were on that one. So I'll listen to them there. And so then I back, went back to the beginning, and I basically just listened to all your podcasts and been listening each week. So I can't remember who turned me on to your podcast, but
Yeah,
I think
no,
it was
and
because of a
it's not about the
guest.
details, but it's like somehow you found our podcast.
Yes,
You
yes.
listen to like 110 episodes now, which is thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you to all our listeners, whether you listen to one or the 110 at this point. Thank you. We're doing this for you. We hope it brings you value. But now look at this. David and I are talking, and there were steps in between too, because I remember you heard an episode, you reached out, then we start talking about your story, and now
Yeah, it was in July.
Say what?
I think it was in July is when
Yeah, July.
we had a conversation. Yeah.
Yeah. So, ladies and gentlemen, behind the camera, behind the scenes, if you're listening, David and I spoke in July, and it is of 22. And now we're recording this in January of 23. So this gentleman has waited months for us to record because we're so backed up, which is a positive thing, right? But it's
Yes.
sad you had to wait that long. And now it'll still be another, who knows how many weeks before this releases. But it's just going to work out in time because somebody's listening to this at just the right time, or they're going to go buy David's book. Support the cause, support Dave. Because when you're buying that book, it's, 15, 20 bucks, 25 bucks for you, but that's going to further people getting the truth because it gives Dave a little bit more breathing room to take time to record a podcast, to tell more people about God, to give them hope, and then to give those books to people in prison for free. So just love each other, sharing the cause. If you got a few extra bucks, buy books. Valentine's Day is coming up. Give them away for Valentine's Day, for different holidays, for Christmas. Show your love by action. So, David, where are you today and where are you heading? How can we get a hold of you, and how can we help you get to your next destination?
Currently, I'm just, working. She's still teaching at the hair school. I've been there for 25 years. Got my wife and children here in Omaha. And then, so as far as reaching out about the book, my website is dilemmamike.com. It's one L and two M's. Everybody has a hard time spelling the word dilemma. All my social media handles are at Dilemma Mike. And also, Amazon is a great place to buy the book. And so if you reach out on any of my socials or through my website, and you have somebody that's incarcerated that needs a copy, you can just reach out to me and I'll ship a copy for free. I have to ship it directly from Amazon because that's how it has to get into the prison. So yeah, I'm willing to do that.
Awesome. And we'll put links to this in the show notes. And David, it's been a true honor. I just want to make sure between your birth and today, is there anything we missed? Is there any significant part of your life we didn't cover? Or is there any final thoughts you want to share with our listeners?
So my final thoughts would be especially in the past couple of years, there's a lot of struggling going on. So I would just say you need to reach out to somebody. Don't hold it in. Don't keep it secret. Don't try to do life on your own. Community is super important. So reach out. Also, your past does not define you. You may have screwed up in life, but that doesn't have to stick with you for the rest of your life. Now, I kind of carry mine through me because I wrote a book about it and I posted it all over the world wide web for people to see, but it doesn't define me as a human being anymore because I know that I am, forgiven. I am totally forgiven. I don't have to think about that stuff anymore. I don't have to let it define me and be a part of my life anymore, other than the only reason why I bring it up is so that other people can know they're not alone. And then I would just say, know that you're forgiven. Like, you don't have to keep begging for it. You don't have to worry about the lightning zap coming out and getting you. God doesn't do that.
Yeah, that's just cartoon stuff. So sometimes we wish it would happen, but it doesn't. It doesn't. Yeah. Not typically. There's always an exception. Yeah. But no, man, David, thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing your story openly and transparently. That's what it's all about. A lot of this stuff, like I said, not that you should feel ashamed, but like you said, you felt shame, and instead of like serving your country, you were behind the wall of a prison looking at a flag, but you've corrected, you've reestablished, and now you're a productive member of society, and more than that, the kingdom of God. So thank you for sharing it, because your successes are great, but your failures and my failures and everybody else's failures, if we share them transparently, hopefully our listeners will be like, oh, I don't have to make that same dumb decision. I can make the good ones. So
Right.
thank you for being here to help everybody.
Yeah, thank you again. I appreciate it.
Yeah, man, it's been an honor. So again, check out David Mike's book. The book's called Dishonor, but you're going to see there's a lot of honor in it. I'm David Pasqualone. Our guest today was David Mike. And don't just listen to this episode, ladies and gentlemen. Like our slogan says, listen to it, but do what you know you have to do. Repeat those positive steps each day so you can have a great life in this world and most importantly, in eternity to come. So again, I'm David. This is David. Reach out to David on his website. Buy the book from Amazon. Check out our Remarkable People book. But more than anything, let's love God, love each other, and make the world a better place. So I'm David Pasqualone. This was David Mike. David, thanks again, brother.
Thank you.
And ladies and gentlemen, we'll see you in another episode. Ciao.
The Remarkable People Podcast. Check it out. The Remarkable People Podcast. Listen, do, repeat. For life. The Remarkable People Podcast.